Good afternoon, everyone, or afternoon if you're in the Eastern Standard Time like me. And thank you so much for joining us today for this screening of Changing Waters. And I'm really excited to have this wonderful panel as well. We'll have a few minutes before I officially start to let everyone filter in. But thank you for being here. Alrighty. Well, thank you for joining us. My name's Emma Bernard, and I am one of the co-coordinators of the Mid-Atlantic Coastal Acidification Network. And this screening is organized in partnership with the OA Alliance by the Coastal Acidification Networks, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. It's also part of our webinar series for Maycan. So a little bit of general overview of how this Zoom webinar works. Everyone's going to be muted and you can put your questions in the Q&A at any time, and there'll be time for questions for our panelists at the end. Everything is going to be recorded and available on our website and on YouTube at the end. So if you want to share, or if you could only make it for part of the webinar, you can find it there. This webinar is in collaboration with all of the coastal acidification networks, as well as the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean CCC work group. A little overview from me to start, then we are honored to have some opening video remarks from Representative Pingree of Maine. We'll have the screening, which is about a 15-minute short film, and then we have our wonderful panel who will be able to introduce themselves and talk more about their work and how it relates to the film topics. So that will be the bulk of this webinar, and then time for Q&A from you all. But before we get into it and before we have these introductory remarks, I've talked about the coastal acidification networks a couple times, and I just wanted to explain who we are. So we are scientists, federal, tribal, state agency representatives, resource managers, nonprofits, you name it. And we are in different regions around the US, as you can see with Cari-CAN as the newest coastal acidification network. And we have these goals on the side. This one really, I think, falls into the category of educating stakeholders on coastal and ocean acidification's impacts and solutions. That's a really crucial part of what we do. And so it's always wonderful when we can partner with incredible groups like the OA Alliance, who create products like this film and just all engage on different impacts and solutions. So I'm going to stop sharing these slides and read a brief introduction to Representative Pingree. So Representative Chellie Pingree has represented the 1st District of Maine since 2008 and is a strong oceans advocate for us in Congress. She sits on the House Agriculture Committee and the House Appropriations Committee, where she chairs the Subcommittee on the Interior and the Environment, the Subcommittee on Agriculture, and the Subcommittee on Military Construction and Veterans Affairs. She's also on many caucuses, including the Aquaculture, Oceans, Safe Climate, and Shellfish caucuses, and she's the vice chair of the Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition. Representative Pingree is a leader in Congress on acidification through bills like the Coastal Communities Ocean Acidification Act of 2025, which she introduced last year. Thank you so much to Representative Pingree and her team for these remarks, which I'm going to share now. And let me know if you can't hear them.
Hi, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Chellie Pingree, and I proudly represent Maine's 1st District. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of today's screening. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person. But I wanted to share a few words about what makes this film so important and the opportunity it gives us to put ocean acidification at the forefront of the climate change conversation. I am so lucky to call Maine home. Part of what makes our state so special is the deep connection we have to the sea. For generations, Mainers have relied on the waters of the North Atlantic, from fishing and lobstering to shipbuilding and aquaculture. The ocean isn't just a vital part of our economy, It's central to our culture and our history, our shared heritage, our very identity. Climate change, and ocean acidification specifically, is putting all of it at dire risk. Global oceans have become approximately 30% more acidic since the Industrial Revolution, and they could experience increases up to 150% by the end of the century. The consequences of disrupting the chemical balance of our oceans are global. It's a reality that many coastal communities around the world are being forced to confront. As many of you know, the Gulf of Maine is especially vulnerable to the impacts of ocean acidification. We're not watching this phenomenon from a distance. We're living it right now in real time. Take our shellfish industry, which accounts for nearly 90% of Maine's commercial fishing revenue. As the waters become more acidic, our clams, oysters, scallops, mussels, and lobster have a harder time growing their shells, making them weaker and less resilient. Scientists warn that if we don't act, the Gulf of Maine could become too acidic for shellfish within the next 25 years. When shellfish struggle, the entire ocean system feels it. The potential impacts on our marine ecosystem and on the lives and livelihoods of millions of people, including thousands of Mainers, are almost impossible to comprehend. And it is not only our lobstermen and oyster farmers, but the entire blue economy and the coastal communities like mine that depend on it. Good news, we have the data, we have the science, and the scientists. We even have some potential solutions. Now it's about getting that information out there. It's about communicating the scope of the crisis and the tools we have to address it to the much wider public. That's what makes films like Changing Water so vital. They give us a chance to see the challenges, to understand the stakes, to meet the people and communities on the front lines of this crisis, and hear their stories and perspectives, to grasp the urgency of the moment. I want to thank the OA Alliance, LUMA Storytelling, and everyone who had a hand in bringing this timely and powerful film to life. You are all doing your job, as are the people in the room. Now it's time for Washington, and Congress especially, to do its job. These are challenging times for the climate movement, especially here in Washington. But we will have another chance, and it's imperative that we make the most of it. We need to take what we've learned from the communities already grappling with the effects of ocean acidification and what we know from the scientists, and make sure we turn that knowledge into real, impactful policy that invests in the long-term health and resilience of our coastal communities, and that acts boldly and creatively and purposefully and gets it all done before it's too late. It's so critically important that we meet this moment and do all we can to protect the ocean and the people and communities who depend on the ocean for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you again to Representative Pingree and her team for that wonderful introduction. Without further ado, we're going to start the film screening. I will turn my camera off during this portion, and then we'll move on to our panel and talk back. So here we go with Changing Water.
I've lived here in the Bay on the Micah Reservation my whole life. The ocean is so important to us because it's something we've depended on since the beginning of time.
The ocean's everything for the Macaws way of life. It's over 50% of our economy. Close to 100% of every household gets fed through the ocean, and it surrounds us on every side.
Shellfish aquaculture around here is absolutely critical. Washington State leads the country in farm shellfish production. About 15 years ago here at the hatchery, our oyster larvae all started to die. At the same time, good friends of ours, another major hatchery on the Oregon coast, their production was collapsing, their larvae were dying. And so we had a real oyster seed crisis.
Another great example is the razor clam density. A member of the Quinault Nation spoke about how he used to harvest razor clams his entire life, and grabbing them, nowadays the shell will break. And it's those observations that we as scientists don't necessarily see because we haven't lived it our entire lives, where they have not only their own experiences, but their ancestors' experiences.
The community there alerted us to something that until that point had been an academic science to become an applied science that needed urgent attention.
I mean, initially we didn't understand. We would look in the bottom of our tanks and we'd see dead oyster larvae. We'd put it under the microscope and all we could see is, yep, it was dead. We didn't understand what was causing it. And it took some time. That water we were sucking in from the ocean is some of the most corrosive water they've measured anywhere in the ocean. Oh, by the way, if you can convince the world to stop burning fossil fuels today, all that bad water is still coming our way.
Washington State has really been referred to as a canary in the coal mine when it comes to thinking about ocean acidification. Here's ocean acidification in a nutshell. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've been burning fossil fuels and releasing a mind-blowing amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the air. Our planet's doing its best to cope, which means that the ocean has been absorbing a huge chunk of that extra CO2 for a long time. But when CO2 mixes with seawater, it changes the ocean's chemistry. CO2 makes seawater more acidic. Imagine lemon juice being added to a glass of water. That shift makes it harder for marine life to survive and grow. Think corals, shellfish, and even tiny plankton that feed bigger animals. When they struggle, the whole ocean ecosystem feels it. Also, ocean acidification is not a simple issue. It interacts with many other factors like ocean currents, increasing water temperature, and pollution from land, especially our poop. It's all dynamically interconnected, like a giant shifting mosaic along our coastlines, which makes it challenging to monitor and forecast how it will affect different regions over time. 70% of all ocean acidification knowledge currently comes for and by the United States, Canada, UK, Europe.
I think that's the hard truth, that we in the Pacific, we contribute very little to CO2 emissions, yet, we are at the forefront of the impacts of climate change.
%98 is ocean, 2% is land. Ocean acidification affects the very basis of the biodiversity of the ocean on which we thrive. Our needs are great, but we are not sitting, waiting with a begging bowl, no.
We need to start doing our monitoring because we don't have any baseline information, we don't have any baseline data, and so whatever decisions we make, it'll be making them blindly. We establish a monitoring site here in Suva, and so every month we go out to collect samples from the site. And so because of the work that's already happening, it is easy for us to approach the government with the issue. They're very receptive. Fiji is the ocean champion in the region. One of the key things we really wanted to do was see how the monitoring we do can actually inform decisions around our food security. And so we know that there's a pilot project in Reva looking at growing oysters. And so we have approached the community to see whether we can deploy our equipment in the site so that, further down the line, who knows, if something happens, we have the scientific information or the data to try to work out why there may be a problem.
Lo que vemos es un enorme desbalance entre la información que tenemos sobre el hemisferio norte y la que tenemos en el hemisferio sur. Entonces, ese vacío de conocimiento no nos permite tomar las mejores decisiones para proteger los océanos.
Hay lugares que aún en América Latina y el Caribe no han hecho una sola medición de cuál es el sistema de carbonatos de sus aguas, ¿verdad?
La ciudad de Santa Marta es una de nuestras ciudades emblemáticas, tiene unos atributos ambientales únicos, somos un laboratorio perfecto para la investigación en las ciencias del mar.
Esta zona tiene unos arrecifes de coral que hay que protegerlos y la disminución del pH en estas zonas pues genera dificultades para que estos organismos se puedan desarrollar, deteriora estos organismos.
Muchas de estas especies están relacionadas con la seguridad alimentaria de las comunidades, especialmente las comunidades costeras, que en países como los nuestros son las más vulnerables. Entonces es un reto desde el punto de vista de todos nuestros países, no solamente aportar el conocimiento científico, sino que ese conocimiento se convierta en decisiones acertadas, en decisiones responsables. Y adicionalmente, esos fenómenos no reconocen fronteras. Lo que pasa aquí en nuestras aguas lo vamos a ver representado en el vecindario, como llamo yo, en el Caribe, con Venezuela, con Panamá, con Costa Rica, con las islas del Caribe.
Por lo menos en la región de América Latina, lo que estamos haciendo es promover la investigación de esta problemática a nivel regional. Estamos participando 18 países, no estamos haciendo cada uno las cosas por separado, sino que hacemos cosas en común y lo que no puede hacer uno, le ayudamos, cooperamos para que en todos los países tener el mismo tipo de información.
Tenemos un grupo de WhatsApp, de hecho, que pues nos dicen, hey, mi equipo está fallando, me está pasando esto, a ti te ha pasado, y bueno, siempre estamos ahí continuamente buscando que entre todos podamos sacar adelante. Eso es lo que nos apasiona, ¿no? El tema de acidificación de océanos, cuando empezamos a trabajar esta temática, pues eran pocos los investigadores, y lo que nos enorgullece es que hoy en día hay más investigadores por país trabajando en esto.
Un problema global tiene que haber acciones globales, por eso tiene que distribuirse el conocimiento no solamente a nuestros gobernantes propios de nuestras naciones, sino que tiene que ser un tema global para que se puedan tomar acciones globales.
One of the strengths of Pacific Island countries is collaboration. We work on a regional basis on a lot of issues. Every international meeting or conference or whatever, we try to bring a one Pacific voice.
Without the Pacific Islands, the ocean would never have been part of the SDG. Of the 17 SDGs, SDG 14 was put into that SDG because of the push from Pacific Island countries. Our call is for the world to realize what we are doing. Negligible emitters, but our contribution to climate change solutions is immense. So now, the sad reality is that it is the least funded. And we think that is a direct correlation of, because it is the least understood.
Our oceans can also be a solution in how we think about combating climate change, but it's really important to get that policy and get that science in balance so we can do that well. we're really trying to build communities of practice around the world where you're bringing together scientists, policymakers, resource managers who really can take a look at what's happening in different ocean basins around the world and prioritize science for management purpose, science for policy solutions in locations that are localized. We really need more of a global conversation around the investment that needs to be put in to support that work going forward.
I'm really enjoying my time here and being able to represent the indigenous communities and more specifically the Macaw tribe. The OA Action Plan is really our key strategies to kind of combat the ocean acidification on our level. We've been stewards of our land and water for so long, and I'm just trying to take that and show Macaw as leaders. Hopefully they can bring indigenous knowledge to Western science and help show an example to the rest of the world.
The Macaw people have always looked at life generationally. Our ancestors always practiced in a way that would be best for generations to come. And what I think about when I think of threats to our resources like ocean acidification, it makes me concerned for what it's going to look like for 3, 4, 5 generations down the road. And where do you sit and where is your identity as a tribe?
Ocean acidification is very daunting, but again, there are bright spots as we start to see this regional picture emerge of communities of practice really building science for purpose. And then we also have many solutions. We have many policy frameworks that we can be leveraging now.
Washington State, I think, is a global leader on acidification because the collaborations have fallen into place. This combination of academics and local tribal governments and researchers coming together is, I think, the ingredients that have led to a successful response. Now that we have such an amazing foundation of scientific work, we translate those data and science into public products to make sure that it keeps expanding in public consciousness. Other things that we're focused on at the Department of Ecology are emphasizing the importance of blue carbon in marine ecosystems. And more importantly than that, we're putting a lot of effort into controlling nutrient pollution. That when wastewater ends up putting nitrogen into the waters of Puget Sound and the coast, that nitrogen ends up making acidification worse on top of the burning of fossil fuel.
What type of science do we need to prioritize to make better choices about seafood security, about livelihoods, about job security? And then how do we put that in climate policy?
That plan has gone on to be a blueprint for many other states and other countries.
Even if it seems like a daunting problem, every bit of progress we make matters.
En lo personal me preocupa, pero también es una preocupación responsable. La obligación desde la ciencia de entender cuáles van a ser los impactos y de proponer soluciones.
I really enjoy the policy work. It's exciting to be able to make a difference, but I really miss growing shellfish. So I started my own farm. It reminds me of why I do the policy work. It grounds me in. When I go out and work hard on my farm, I can look back and say, oh, look, we harvested 10,000 pounds of clams today, and my body's sore and I hurt, but it's really gratifying because I can see I got something done.
It means a lot to me to be able to pass to my kids what it means to be Macaw and what it means to not only harvest resources, but to do it in a manner that's consistent with our traditional core values.
So we are gearing up to fight. We are going to fight all the way till the end. We have no other alternative. This is existential for us, and we are going to keep fighting.
Wow. Thank you to the OA Alliance for letting us share that incredible film, and just congratulations on all the work you all put into it. Now I'm really excited to turn it over to our panel. I have an opening question for each of you, and as part of that, if you could give an introduction to yourself and your work, that would be great. But I wanted to, before we get in that, just remind folks there's the Q&A box, bottom right hand of your screen. You can add questions, comments in there, and we also want to make sure we prioritize answering your questions as well as mine. So make sure to start adding those into the chat. But that was incredible. I've watched this a couple of times now, and it's still so good. I wanted to start off so with Juliana Corrales from the OA Alliance, but I had a question for you, which was, how did you choose to highlight these case studies as you were making the film?
Thank you so much, Emma. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me as part of this great panel, but also for organizing the screening. It's basically one of the reasons why we made this film, right? To have it shown multiple times. And thank you so much. But yeah, just to provide some context about me and why I'm here, I have been working with the OA Alliance since 2020. My work as creative communications leads focuses on providing creative direction, including brand development, creating effective communication strategies, and expanding the Alliance's communications efforts. This short film that we just saw is one of the main examples of that. As I started getting more involved in the work by the OA Alliance and its network, I noticed, one, the amazing people and stories involved in this community, and two, the fact that few people outside the field knew about their efforts. So this was a missed opportunity for me, because one thing the ocean and climate narrative often lacks is stories of hope and tangible solutions. So we wanted to fill that gap. And in terms of what case studies we wanted to feature, we wanted to pick communities of practice that showed how different actors are coming together to tackle this issue in a place-based setting, which aligns a lot with the OA Alliance's regional approach as well. So, for example, in the US, we chose Washington State, not only because it is where everything started for the Alliance, but also there we see the clearest example of science partners working directly with state government, seafood industry, and tribal leaders to identify and support the science that is going to be most useful for real-life outcomes and decision making. So yeah, we're lucky to have Micah here in the panel, so I'm sure he'll be able to expand more on that aspect. But overall, we wanted to highlight three main ideas, which was the unequal financial investment in OA monitoring and scientific work around the world, the need for increased investment and connection of this work to real-life outcomes and policy decisions, and of course, to show the heroic commitment of OA researchers around the world who are evidently advancing this globally important issue with very little support. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Moving over to Kyle Pepperman, the Executive Director of the Downeast Institute. Thank you so much for being here. Since the Northeast and the Gulf of Maine was not featured in this video, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impacts and influences of coastal and ocean acidification on your work at Downeast Institute and as a shellfish grower.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, us at Downeast Institute, we're a marine research, education, and innovation center, and we operate a commercial and research bivalve hatchery. And very similar to what Bill described, unexplained mortalities and larval loss, particularly during settlement times. And we started seeing that well, quite a few years ago now. So much so where we were really worried that we would, that we were failing ourselves and what are we doing wrong? And so we've had to start doing what I'm assuming Taylor's is doing as well, with buffering our seawater to combat this acidic water coming into our shellfish hatcheries. We're the only commercial mussel hatchery, blue mussel hatchery on the East Coast of the United States, and mussel farmers right now are seeing just no wild mussel settlement, and I think it can largely be attributed to these effects of OA. So, we've had to develop the technologies to get the mussels through their juvenile period and get them settled so that our aquaculturists could grow them on their farms for their, economic benefit and for the production of really sustainable protein from the ocean at scale. We also, at the same time, we started seeing these larval losses, said, well, we got to figure this out. So we invested in creation of an ocean acidification laboratory here at Downeast Institute with pH and temperature controlled tanks so that we can test different buffer formulations. So we can, invest in some analytical equipment to look at saturation state of aragonite and how is that affecting the animals that are so important to not only our operation, but the quality of life for the people that we serve in a largely natural resources based economy. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to get better. But getting ahead of it and finding out novel solutions on how we can sustain ourselves and our communities in the face of an increasingly acidifying and warming ocean is kind of what we're out to do. So it motivates us to try a little bit harder for not only us, but for our neighbors.
Incredible to hear about the work you're doing. I also since we have a variety of different backgrounds for our audience, aragonite saturation state's a way of measuring this form of calcium carbonate that shellfish use to create their shells, and it's a really important measure for ocean acidification and coastal acidification. So thank you for bringing that up and just doing my little dictionary moment there. Moving along to Micah, our guest appearance from the film. Now we're seeing you again. I would love to hear more about how you would recommend that other regions or state governments that are either being impacted differently or not being impacted as drastically as Washington State by acidification plan for future monitoring and collaboration, like what you talk about in the film.
Yeah, thank you for having me. That's a great question. And it's something that Washington has experience with because we are kind of ahead on ocean acidification science and response, but that's only because the impacts hit here first. So something that can happen in a place that is not so acutely affected by acidification right now is monitoring can get started at least at some level so that this is not a pre-human baseline, but it is really useful to have information as early as possible in order to quantify the amount of human impact. And that's important not just for regulatory purposes to decide whether or not waters are impaired, but also for public communication, because you can get out ahead of some of the issues that Washington has had to struggle through. And those could include looking through the literature or starting new experiments to figure out which local species that are very important are most sensitive to acidification. In some cases, there's ways to keep those species going if they're amenable to rearing them in a hatchery. In other cases, if you get it far enough ahead, you can start to transition to other species. That's a big deal and very disruptive to industry, but in some cases, it may be the only option. In Washington State, we depend on Pacific oysters, which are a great crop, but they happen to be very sensitive to acidification. So that's one of the reasons why we started suffering early. Another maybe silver lining thing about getting started early is hopefully the communication with the public on ocean acidification can be used to motivate change more gradually rather than doing it all at once. So explaining to folks that reducing the amount of nitrogen that we put into coastal waters and transitioning off of fossil fuel as quickly as possible, that's important for climate change, that's important for water quality with dissolved oxygen, but it's also important for acidification, which is an issue that most people have not heard about, even though, some of us in this room think about it constantly. So helping people understand, yes, it's going to cost money upfront to upgrade our wastewater treatment plants to put less nitrogen in the water, but that's going to do everything from benefit dissolved oxygen, all the way to help organisms in the ocean preserve their ability to build their shells and mature and support our food systems and economies. So those are some of the thoughts that came to mind about kind of starting in a place where the impacts aren't felt quite yet.
Thank you. I think those are some really good lessons about monitoring and biological impacts that we can all take for our different regions. Speaking of, moving along to Jose, Cari-CAN is the newest addition to the Coastal Acidification Network family, and we are super excited about the work you all are doing. Jose, could you tell us a little bit about some of the largest issues, that's a good pun there, facing the Caribbean region due to coastal and ocean acidification, and what stakeholder needs you're hearing about that are either similar or different than those discussed in the film?
Yeah, lovely. Thank you for that, Emma. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here. I really appreciate it. I'm just gonna, describe what Cari-CAN does. I imagine very similar, or it's very similar to what you guys do at Maycam, but Cari-CAN I'm the coordinator for the Caribbean Coastal Acidification Network. And it plays a role in strengthening regional collaboration here in the U.S. Caribbean, which is, Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Expanding knowledge, conducting monitoring and research, and supporting science-based solutions, to address acidification across our region. And so I really appreciate that question over, what are our largest issues here in the Caribbean? I would say that coastal acidification can happen here in the Caribbean due to sargassum. I don't know if you guys, or if you all here have heard about sargassum. It's a macroalgae, grows out in the pelagic Atlantic. It's also in the Pacific as well, but it's more of a nuisance, becomes more of a nuisance here in the Atlantic, and it can accumulate on shore and cause very similar impacts as sedimentation. And that's also another stressor here that we face here in Puerto Rico. And so, I would say those are some of the biggest issues. Obviously, there's also diseases and invasive species, but I would say that the combination of these stressors, I think Kyle mentioned it earlier, it's also happening in the context of a warming ocean. And so I think it's important to take that into consideration because, the coral exists, or the animal exists in but all the conditions in which it's in. And so, we can talk about acidification, but, it's difficult to estimate its impacts when it's happening in conjunction with all these other factors. And in terms of like the stakeholder needs that we're hearing about here in Puerto Rico or in the U.S. Caribbean, I would say I think the theme is more monitoring. There's only really been monitoring in the Southwest, maybe, and some parts of the city in San Juan. And so, especially on the east side of the island, there's not much data. There's no baseline data as sorry, who was as the man from Washington. I forget. Can you say it, Emma?
Oh, Micah?
Micah, yeah, as Micah said. And so I like to say people's names. And so, those are some of the stakeholder needs, especially for our coral reef restoration practitioners and things like that, like them knowing what the baseline is and where to plan, I think is going to be key in the future, and to understand, again, what the combination of stressors is telling us. And yeah, I mean, that's really big, especially more specific, like the plankton and the bioluminescent bays, like how does COA and OA in general impact those regions and areas that bring a lot of important tourism and economy to the island.
Thank you. I'm seeing a question in the chat that I think is really relevant to things that Kyle, Micah, and Jose all brought up. But Bill asked, does acidification intensify in saltwater bodies that are located in or near more populous areas? And also, do freshwater bodies and estuaries suffer similarly to saltwater bodies from acidification? One of my questions was, how do you talk about coastal versus ocean acidification drivers, which very much connects into this topic. Unless someone else wants to jump in, I might direct this to Micah, but if anyone has any other things to add in, since we've talked about ocean drivers, we've talked about coastal drivers, just to clarify between that a little bit.
I would say runoff. Urban areas have a lot of runoff and those types of nutrients, like wastewater, like Micah said. I'm sure you can explain it better than I can, but that is a big issue here in Puerto Rico as well, with all the urbanized areas that exist on the coast. So most of the urbanized areas are on the coast, and so all of that's going to run off and cause stress and likely cause acidification in some aspects on the coast.
Yeah, it's true in the mid-Atlantic too.
Yeah, Jose captured it. Ocean acidification overall is being driven by more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere getting into the ocean. But on top of that, when nitrogen, or in some cases phosphate, gets into the ocean, that causes phytoplankton to bloom. And then when that dies and decomposes, it releases extra carbon dioxide on top of what we're putting in through fossil fuels and makes acidification worse. To a lesser extent, there's also potentially the issue of local atmospheric pollution. That's something that we're trying to get more precise estimate of in the Pacific Northwest, but you can actually measure regional elevation of carbon dioxide in an area where a lot is being put into the air, like at rush hour around Seattle. CO2 in the air is higher than it is in rural areas 100 miles away. That mixes fairly quickly, but we're trying to understand whether that CO2 locally in the air is exerting extra pressure on water right next to a populated area. And then for the other half of the question, I guess just briefly, yes, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere also causes acidification in freshwater systems. We don't have as much science on that. The really quick summary is that carbon dioxide levels in freshwater are naturally more variable than in seawater to begin with. So it's harder to pick out the human pressure there. And it also hasn't received quite as much attention because it's not as important, the cultivation of shellfish in freshwater. So, and many of those species that are native to freshwater environments are adapted to stressful conditions, at least temporarily, because naturally CO2 levels fluctuate so much. But it's an added stressor that over time will become more important in freshwater as well.
I'll add one thing that, where both Micah and I are in northern latitudes. The dissolution of carbon dioxide in cold water is exacerbated. So I know in Maine, we're really focused on what the things like the Labrador Slope Current is going to do as it dumps really cold, salty, mineral-rich water into the Gulf of Maine, and what that's going to mean for us going forward. So definitely a concern, as well as freshwater input.
Thank you. And I'll just note that in addition to looking at freshwater, saltwater, the mid-Atlantic, we have a lot of estuaries and bays. And so figuring out the best way to monitor in these very variable ecosystems where there's also a lot of biodiversity is another pressing issue. So across that gradient, it's very important to gain more research. I think this is a relevant question to go back to you, Hula. For coastal and ocean acidification is a really complicated issue, as this panel is already touching on from a technical standpoint. And so when you were making the film, how did you navigate the balance of how much technical information to include for a general audience?
Thank you. Yeah, so this has always been a challenge in communicating ocean acidification and, in my humble opinion, in climate ocean change issues overall. For the general public, they are too abstract, complex, and hard to relate to. So this short film falls under our creative communications program, where we want to complement the science. I love to have all these guys here talking about all these technical issues, and I come with the emotional side because that's what we wanted to do, like complement science, but focusing on elements that connect and move our emotions. Our objective through this program is to make the unseen impact of climate ocean change seen and emotionally felt. And the reason behind that is because social psychological research shows that simply generating knowledge and awareness toward protecting the environment, including the ocean, very rarely produces behavior change. I mean, it's necessary, but it's good to complement it. So we wanted to make the story of OA more human. We needed to find that right balance between science and storytelling. And that's why we hired a professional to guide us through the process. We relied on Monica from LUMA Storytelling. She's a filmmaker to let us know like the right way to make the issue engaging in a way we've never done it before. If people can understand the causes and relate on an emotional level to them, they can better relate to the solutions and hopefully be moved to do something. So yeah.
Thank you. Kind of speaking to the human and emotional side of ocean acidification a little bit more. Kyle, a common thread between Representative Pingree's remarks and the film was the cultural importance of shellfish in a lot of places and these different foodways. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit more on fisheries as part of the culture in Maine as well as a food resource? And I mean, I've spent some time in Maine. I know it's really important, but just if folks don't have Mainers in their lives.
Yeah, sure. So, shell fisheries and fisheries in general in Maine are so important as heritage resources. Really, our culture all the way back to the founding is based in fisheries and natural resources. And over the course of time, we've seen shifts in fisheries where where I'm sitting right now used to be a historic sardine fishery that no longer exists. We've seen our shrimp fishery go away because of ocean heat waves. We just keep eating our way right down the food web. And lobsters right now is our key fishery in the state. We produce more lobsters in Maine than anywhere else, and it's a huge industry. But as the effects of OA, affects not only the lobsters but the things that they eat, it really threatens that. And, I think we're seeing a lot more aquaculture in the state of Maine now as a response to this, because we're able to get things like oysters from hatcheries and be able to sort of combat the early life history effects or impacts rather from OA. But yeah, I don't know where it's going to go. We're hopeful that, our ocean stays cold and clean and rich, but we're certainly going to have challenges, and we'll probably see more species shift. Now we're seeing black sea bass in the Gulf of Maine, which is crazy. You never saw that. We're seeing blue crabs that are endemic to the Chesapeake in southern Maine. They're probably just going to keep coming up the coast, and I think people just need to be, kind of rolling with the punches and be resilient, but have their eyes open that there is change happening in it, and it's happening very fast.
Thank you. Yes, I used to live in Rhode Island, and the black sea bass were moving in there when I was in Rhode Island, but now in Maine, that's things are changing. José, back to you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the first steps that you at Cari-CAN have taken to engage communities around coastal and ocean acidification in the Caribbean.
Yes, thank you. So the first steps we did was we conducted a survey to get an understanding of what's the level of knowledge, who's interested, what groups are interested in coastal and ocean acidification. And so we used that survey to help design our first workshop that we did at the end of 2024, where we pretty much introduced the CAN to all the different stakeholder groups that we had surveyed and other groups that had heard about the workshop. And we had quite a bit of NGOs, different folks from academia, folks from the territorial agencies like the Department of Natural Resources, and things like that. And so it was a very successful workshop, presentations and all sorts of things, working groups. I was there, so it was a fun event. Learned a lot too. And so, I think that was a great introduction for folks, the key stakeholder groups in Puerto Rico and USVI to get initiated with what the CAN does and what it's for. And then we went on to establish the steering committee, which has folks from all these different sectors that I mentioned, academia, NGOs, and territorial agencies like DNER. And so I think those were our huge our first big steps. And so we're looking forward to keep pushing what we're trying to do.
Thank you. So not only is this panel a call to action, but at the end of the day, Changing Waters is at its core a call to action. For Hula, what are some suggestions for viewers who after today are inspired to take action on coastal and ocean acidification, but don't necessarily know where to start? And that is, aside from, of course, reaching out to your local coastal acidification network, we are here to connect you with the work that's going on in your region. And well, I believe you had a slide about this as well.
Yes, I do. So, but yeah, thanks for the question. Actually, just before showing it, when producing the short film, we went back and forth on whether or not to include any written calls to action at the end of the film. We wanted to put like a long list at the end. And guided by our director's advice, we decided to leave it open so that we could then provide different calls to action tailored to different audiences, such as like in this occasion, as useful and most appropriate. But I will share my screen. I have a list. What? What are you seeing? Do you see my presentation?
Yes, yeah? We don't see the okay. Bullet points yet, though.
The bullet points. Okay, so this is the list that we have of like the most pertinent actions that we call at the Alliance. And I've heard some of them already been mentioned here. But first of all, policies that transition the world to clean, renewable energy sources and away from fossil fuels is the #1 way to combat ocean acidification. Plant blue carbon habitats and restore coastal ecosystems. Embrace climate smart conservation measures. Update fisheries and aquaculture management practices. Reduce sources of local land-based pollution. Evaluate the risks or benefits of marine carbon dioxide removal strategies. And last but not least, increase investment and policy action on this issue globally and locally. I'll stop sharing. No.
And if you have questions about how to do any of these things or how this looks different in different regions, we have 8 minutes left, so make sure to get your questions in before the panel wraps up or follow up with us later. I wanted to ask all of you, just as we're wrapping up, what is something you're working on that you're excited about? And if you could just say one thing, and this is really hard, and I hate when people ask this, but one thing that you could suggest attendees do to take action if they're inspired by the film, what would that one thing be? I am going to send this over to Micah first, and then we can go around.
Oh my gosh. So one of the things, I guess, because I primarily do science work that I'm most excited about is that we in Washington, to advance our monitoring, are right about at the point where we're getting sensors on board ships. So we're having kind of a public-private partnership, getting instruments on board a boat that goes between Washington State and Canada every day. And that's specifically the tool that we're going to use to answer these questions about how much carbon dioxide emissions from Seattle and big urban centers are directly affecting Puget Sound, the big estuary that we all live next to, the chemistry there. So that is going to get started this year, and I think it's going to help us, further inform and motivate the public to transition away from fossil fuel burning vehicles and house heating in order to help preserve the saltwater system that we all love and depend on. And I guess for one thing that people can do on ocean acidification, anyone who is already invested in climate change and taking action on that is already an inadvertent advocate for solving ocean acidification. Efforts like reducing nitrogen from wastewater and improving blue carbon outputs and carbon capture through human interventions all have some impact, but really the thing that we have to solve is getting off of the burning of fossil fuels. No amount of mitigation is going to counteract continued use of fossil fuels. So individual action to make those changes and demonstrate that we can continue to have a high quality of life without using these polluting forms of transportation and life is a positive one. I think just setting an example and political advocacy is also important on that front.
Thank you so much, Micah. I'll pass it over to Kyle next, and also seeing some questions for you in the chat about what types of monitoring equipment.
Cool. So, I mean, one of the things that we're pretty jazzed up to do right now is continue with working with industry members, particularly in the aquaculture industry, working with mussel farmers to look at, the sort of fluctuations in total alkalinity around storm events and comparing that to densities of things like mussel larvae that's in the water. To show when we have these absolute like mussel recruitment failures, can we link that, to this coastal ocean acidification? And by showing people if that is the case, which it likely is, that something like a larger scale hatchery is a way for them to insulate their businesses from these changes and be able to spur investment in more shellfish hatcheries to combat this sort of early life history mortality in things such as mussels, softshell clams, sea urchins, oysters. And I guess selfishly, what can people do? Eat more aquaculture shellfish. If there's demand for the product, then we'll have more investment in ways to consistently produce this in the face of ocean acidification. And that will help to educate people on the importance of sustainable protein produced from our ocean, which is, really how we should be feeding ourselves in a changing climate and changing world.
Thank you so much. I'll also drop in the chat, you've mentioned the biological impacts on early life stages a couple different times, which is super important. We have some graphics up about some iconic species of the mid-Atlantic and Northeast and some of the impacts at early life stages. So I just put that in there. I'm gonna pass it back over to Jose for the same question. Since it's been a little while, I'll repeat, what's something you're working on that you're excited about? And what's one thing you would suggest folks do to take action?
One thing that we're really excited that we're working on right now is our website. It should be coming out soon, hopefully in the next few weeks or so. And I'm really excited about it because it's going to have a lot of resources, it's going to have a lot of information that I think is going to be able to fuel the push for more monitoring, which is something that I kind of want to, I cheated the question. I have two things. And so I think that will be the push for more monitoring here in the Caribbean region, which is really necessary because it can inform a bunch of other things that we need to work on in terms of management of our coasts. And then what is one thing when you say this question or when you mention this question, my first thought was to think back to the end of the video when there's a guy or a man saying join the fight, and I would say that I think that is an incredibly good call to action, in my opinion. I think think of it like a fight and think of it like just like a fight, yeah. And to me that means join monitoring efforts and to push your local government or your state government to invest more and your federal government to invest more in monitoring, but not just that, but in the things that Kyle mentioned, like sustainable proteins and things like that. I think it's a great mention. I also think that's a great direction we should be going towards, and to share that knowledge that you get from the video with your friends and family. Again, cheated the question, but sorry.
Thank you. And now, if you could close us out with you've already given us some actions, but something you're excited about.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jose, for promoting the film screenings, because that was actually gonna be my action. But well, I'm excited to be on this phase of the short film, which is like the promotional phase of the film. I'm basically using it as a vessel to help the OA Alliance to fulfill its vision and mission, and like show the work that all of you guys are doing. So this screening today is part of this stage and that we're at, and we're extremely grateful for you guys to Emma, you and your team for organizing the event. I just wanted to flag that at the end of February, we launched the screening kit. So we basically made this kit with all information. I will share, maybe I can give it to you, Emma, and you can share it in the chat with everyone.
Absolutely.
The link to the kit. But basically, we have an array of great resources to plan a screening, big or small as you want, like an event planning guide, recommendations for promotion, roundtable sample questions. And coming soon, we'll have some activation materials for educators, policymakers, scientists, and conservationists. And yeah, besides all the other calls to actions, I think just want to say that, yeah, host the screening, start the conversation, and hopefully inspire more people to talk about this and do more. I'll share the link with you.
Well, this is so inspiring. Thank you again to all of our panel members. I will say briefly that I'm really excited about a lot of different projects coming up with the coastal acidification networks. At MACAN, we're working on a ocean coastal acidification video game as an education resource. So if that's of interest to you, get on our email list or reach out to me. And then my action would be connect with your local coastal acidification network. I put in the chat the different coastal acidification network contacts, but also there are acidification networks beyond the US. We have a partner from the Canada's ocean acidification community of practice on the webinar I'm seeing as well. And there's so many different groups to reach out to. So there's lots of ways to get involved. I know we've gone over, so thank you everyone for your time. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to the OA Alliance and LUMA. And I'm just so inspired and excited by this conversation. So have a good one, you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.